She worked on the golf course collecting balls. The wealthy guests laughed, thinking she couldn't even hit the ball, but her shot silenced them and changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The sun had barely risen when the first streaks of light fell across the manicured green of the Fairview Golf Club. A thin veil of mist clung to the grass, glowing pale gold as the sky shifted from gray to pink. For most of the people who came here, this hour was reserved for coffee and emails, for lounging in kitchens with marble counters and endless supplies of imported beans. But for Hannah Reid, this was the busiest part of her day. She drove the range cart slowly across the dew-drenched field, the little machine growling and rattling as it swallowed the scattered golf balls into its metal maw. Every few minutes she stopped, climbed down, and used the long picker to gather the stubborn ones that hid just beyond the cart's reach. Her sneakers were soaked through before the sun was properly up. Her hands stung from the cold, but she moved quickly, knowing that once the first players arrived, the range had to look spotless, ready for them to practice their perfect swings without ever wondering who had made the place so pristine. Hannah had been working here for 6 months, ever since the bills piled too high on the kitchen table and her part-time job at the grocery store wasn't enough. She was 17, but she felt older than most adults she knew. The death of her mother 2 years earlier had left her with more than grief. It had left her with a younger brother, Caleb, in a tiny rented house whose rent came due every 30 days regardless of whether she slept or cried or worked herself raw. Caleb was 12, lanky and quiet, and still too young to understand that Hannah wasn't just his sister anymore. She had become something between a parent and a guardian angel who never seemed to rest. Their father had been gone even longer, disappearing from their lives when Hannah was still small, leaving behind only a box of old photographs and a few unpaid debts that her mother had struggled to clear. Now there was no one left to carry the weight but Hannah. She drove the cart back to the small shed at the edge of the property, where the collected balls would be washed and poured into wire baskets for the members. The shed smelled of grass clippings, gasoline, and faintly of mildew, but it was private, and Hannah liked that about it. In the far corner, behind an old bag of fertilizer and a stack of broken rakes, leaned a single battered golf club, wrapped in a rag to protect it from rust. It had belonged to her grandfather, the man who had taught her to swing a club when she was little, back when golf still felt like a game rather than a world she could never enter. He had worked at a public course as a groundskeeper and would take Hannah there on quiet afternoons, placing bright orange practice balls on the rough and telling her to breathe before she swung. Golf is not about strength, he had always said, his voice steady and calm. It's about stillness. You find the quiet inside you, and the ball will go where it's supposed to go. Those afternoons had been her happiest memories, not because she was good at the game, though she was, but because it made her feel close to him, as though they shared a secret language no one else understood. He had died the year before her mother, and that was the day the game had ended for her. His old set of clubs had been sold to pay for funeral costs, all except the 7-iron she had begged to keep. It was the only thing she had left of him, a link to a world that felt like it had been ripped away piece by piece. Sometimes, when the range was empty and the stars were out, she would take the club and 1 or 2 stray balls and hit them into the night just to feel that brief moment of flight. She couldn't afford lessons or a membership. The fees were laughably beyond her reach, but she still knew the game in her bones, every grip and stance and weight shift drilled into her by the man who had believed she could be anything. This evening was different. There was a restlessness in the air from the moment Hannah arrived for her late shift. The main clubhouse was lit up like a cathedral, golden light spilling from every window, and the parking lot gleamed with rows of imported cars. Tonight was the annual Fairview Charity Invitational, an event that drew the wealthiest families from 3 counties and raised astonishing sums for causes that sounded noble when printed on glossy brochures. Hannah had never been inside the clubhouse during one of these events, but she had seen the photographs in the local paper. Women in sequined gowns laughing behind crystal glasses, men in tailored suits talking about business between rounds of golf. For the staff, these nights meant extra work, more cleanup, more orders barked by the manager, more hours that stretched long after midnight. Hannah worked in near silence, collecting the last of the stray balls near the far fence of the range. Music drifted from the clubhouse, mingling with the faint hum of conversation and clinking glasses. She couldn't help glancing toward the glow of the terrace where guests were gathered. Part of her wanted to hate them, but mostly she just felt a gnawing curiosity. What it would be like to stand among them, to belong there without being told she was in the way. The thought made her cheeks burn. She slung the last basket of balls into the shed and started walking back across the edge of the property, her shoes crunching on gravel. It happened suddenly. One of the range balls she had missed earlier had rolled down toward the VIP practice area, a strip of perfect green cordoned off by ropes and lanterns. Hannah hesitated, then crossed the rope to retrieve it. The ground felt different under her feet, so smooth it was almost slippery. She bent to pick up the ball and froze when she heard laughter. A group of guests was standing just a few yards away, their drinks in hand, speaking with the easy confidence of people who had never worried about money. Their words drifted across the air, sharper than the laughter itself. "Imagine thinking anyone can just pick up a club and play," one man was saying. "This sport isn't for everyone." "It shouldn't be," a woman added, her diamond bracelet flashing in the light. "Otherwise, it wouldn't be special." "Kids from town don't even know the rules," another voice chimed in. "I saw one try to swing once. Nearly hit himself in the head." They all laughed. Hannah felt her chest tighten. She knew they weren't talking about her specifically, but it didn't matter. They were talking about people like her, about Caleb, about anyone who didn't have the money to buy their way onto these immaculate greens. She turned to leave, but in that instant, she was spotted. A tall, elegant woman stepped forward from the group, her silver hair pinned back and her black evening dress gleaming. Hannah recognized her at once. Margaret Lawson, the owner of Fairview Golf Club. Margaret was a legend among the staff, known for her business acumen and her ability to smile while firing people on the spot. She looked at Hannah with a faint expression of disdain, as though the girl were a stain on the otherwise flawless night. "What are you doing here?" Margaret's voice was cool and commanding. Hannah opened her mouth to explain, but Margaret waved a hand toward one of the uniformed attendants nearby. "Remove her from the practice area," she said, as if Hannah were an unwanted animal. The attendant took a step forward, and for a moment Hannah thought about simply walking away, keeping her head down as she always did. But something inside her rebelled. Maybe it was the laughter still ringing in her ears, or the memory of her grandfather's words, or the hollow ache in her stomach that reminded her she hadn't had dinner yet. Before she could stop herself, she straightened her back and spoke in a voice that sounded steadier than she felt. She asked for a chance, one chance to take a shot from the practice green in exchange for a meal. She didn't know why she said it. The words just came out, bold and clear, hanging in the air like a challenge. For a moment there was silence. Then the group began to murmur, intrigued. Margaret's eyebrows lifted in faint amusement, and Hannah felt the weight of every eye on her. The woman's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How quaint," she said softly, loud enough for everyone to hear. The other guests chuckled, and someone muttered something about entertainment. Hannah felt her face flush, but she didn't look away. Somewhere deep inside, a spark had been lit. Tonight would not end the way they expected. Tonight, for the first time since she had taken this job, she would not just fade into the background. She would show them who she was, or she would fail trying. As Margaret turned back to her guests, issuing quick instructions that set the crowd in motion, Hannah's heart pounded. She didn't know what she had just set in motion, but she knew one thing with absolute clarity. She would not run from it. Not this time. The guests gathered slowly at first, drifting closer to the practice area, as though drawn by some invisible current. The murmurs spread quickly. The grounds girl was going to hit a shot right here, in front of everyone. At first it was amusement, but soon the crowd was large enough that waiters carrying trays of champagne paused to watch, curious. Hannah stood very still on the edge of the grass, her pulse thundering in her ears. She could see Margaret Lawson speaking in a low voice to a few of the men near her, their smiles widening as she gestured toward Hannah like she was a novelty. Whatever was being planned was not meant to be kind. Hannah felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her shoulders, but she refused to let her arms tremble. She had asked for this, Now she had to face it. Margaret turned back toward the growing circle of onlookers, her expression calm, almost theatrical. She called for silence with a slight raise of her hand, and the chatter dimmed to a quiet hum. Then she announced clearly and with a touch of relish that they were going to have a little fun. The girl had requested a chance to hit a shot, and they would grant it, but there had to be stakes. A ripple of anticipation went through the guests, as if she had just promised them an unscheduled performance. Margaret said the shot would be taken from the far bunker on the edge of the range, one of the most difficult spots to escape from, even for members who practiced regularly. If Hannah's ball reached the green and stayed there, she would be rewarded with a proper dinner and even a paid day off. If she failed, she would leave the property immediately and not be welcome back. Laughter rose like champagne bubbles in the night air, some people clapping as though this were a game arranged for their amusement. Hannah felt the heat rise in her face. She could have refused, could have walked away right then, but she knew she couldn't go back to being invisible. The humiliation she had felt only moments before would grow into something unbearable if she let herself be escorted out without even trying. She nodded once tightly, and the crowd cheered as if her agreement was exactly what they had wanted. Margaret gestured toward one of the attendants, who hurried off to fetch a ball and place it in the sand trap. The distance looked enormous in the soft light, the green far away under the glow of the lanterns. Hannah's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to breathe. The shed where the workers stored equipment was dark and quiet when she stepped inside. She pushed past the rakes and bags of soil until she found the old rag-wrap club leaning in the corner. Her grandfather's 7-iron felt heavy in her hands, the grip worn smooth by years of use. She unwrapped it slowly, running her thumb along the shaft, and for a moment the noise of the party outside seemed to fade. She remembered summer evenings on the public course, when the sky was pink and gold, and her grandfather would crouch behind her, adjusting her stance. "Plant your feet," he would say. "Let the swing come from your shoulders. Trust the ground." The memory steadied her. She wiped the grip on her shirt, took a long breath, and walked back out toward the lights. The crowd parted slightly as she approached. The sand trap loomed ahead, its pale surface glowing under the floodlights. She stepped into it carefully, feeling the soft give beneath her shoes. The ball was there, half buried, daring her. Around her the guests whispered and chuckled, placing bets on how far the ball would fly. Not how close it would land to the green, but how spectacularly it might fail. Hannah ignored them. She planted her feet just as her grandfather had taught her and took a few practice swings, letting the club cut through the air with a hiss. The sound helped her focus. When she finally addressed the ball, she could feel the silence gathering around her. The laughter died down, leaving only the faint buzz of the lights and the distant clink of glasses from the clubhouse terrace. She drew back and swung. For a fraction of a second, nothing existed but the sharp thud of club against sand, the burst of grit flying into the air, and the white flash of the ball rising into the night. It sailed higher than she expected, curving gracefully before dropping toward the green. Time seemed to slow as everyone watched. The ball hit the grass, bounced once, twice, and rolled to a stop just a few yards from the flag. Gasps rose from the spectators, followed by scattered applause. Someone let out a low whistle. Hannah exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by something sharper. Pride. She had done it, and done it well. But Margaret was already stepping forward, her smile fixed in place. She praised the shot with a tone that carried no warmth, then announced that one good strike did not prove anything. Perhaps it had been luck, she suggested. A single shot could always be lucky. If Hannah wanted her reward, she should do it again, but this time from a harder position, a shot that no one could dismiss as chance. The crowd murmured in agreement, some excited, some uneasy. The game was no longer lighthearted. There was an edge to the air now, a sense that something more important than dinner was at stake. Hannah's fingers tightened around the club. She could walk away, collect the small victory of having silenced their laughter once, but something inside her refused to let it end there. The first shot had not been enough, not for them and not for her. She nodded once more, feeling the weight of every eye on her, and followed the attendant to the next spot. The ball was placed on the fringe near a patch of rough grass, requiring a delicate chip to reach the hole. The green seemed very far away now, bathed in silver light and surrounded by expectant faces. The night air felt cooler, sharper, as though the entire field was holding its breath. Hannah crouched slightly, feeling the ground beneath her shoes, the texture of the sand and grass mixed. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat and let the memory of her grandfather steady her again. She was no longer aware of the people or the cameras or the soft rustle of expensive clothes around her. All that existed was the ball, the club in her hands, and the quiet space between one breath and the next. When she stood and lifted the club, her shoulders were relaxed, her stance balanced. She could feel the shot before she took it, as though the motion had already been written in her muscles years ago. When she swung, the ball rose cleanly, spinning through the air toward the distant green. For a moment there was only silence, every guest frozen in place, watching the arc. The ball landed on the green, hopped once, and rolled steadily toward the flag. It did not stop until it rested a few feet from the hole. A sound went through the crowd, not laughter this time, but something closer to astonishment. Several guests broke into applause and a few even cheered. Hannah stood still, breathing hard, her hands trembling now, not from fear but from release. She had done what they thought was impossible, and she had done it in front of them all. The tension that had built over the last few minutes broke, replaced by a rising chatter, people turning to one another with wide eyes. Margaret's smile had grown thin, the muscles at her jaw tight. She could no longer laugh it off as luck. The shot had been too precise, too controlled. Hannah, still standing on the edge of the green, lowered the club and straightened her shoulders. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to meet Margaret's eyes. She did not speak. She didn't have to. The message was clear. She had earned her place here, at least for tonight. As the crowd began to disperse slightly, voices growing louder and more animated, Hannah stepped back from the green and felt the night air rush into her lungs. The challenge had been met, but she knew this was not the end. Something had shifted in the air, something that could not be taken back. The taste of victory was sharp and almost frightening, because it left her hungry for more. Whatever happened next, she was no longer just the girl who picked up golf balls in the morning mist. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The night had taken on a strange stillness after Hannah's last shot, as though the entire club had exhaled and was now waiting for something more. Guests lingered near the green instead of returning to their cocktails and quiet conversations, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of lanterns. The murmurs were no longer mocking but curious, speculative. People were whispering about the grounds girl with the perfect swing, about how she had struck the ball with more composure than many of the members themselves. Some of them were impressed, others uneasy, but no one was indifferent. Hannah stood on the fringe, the club still in her hands, her chest rising and falling as her heartbeat slowed. The air was cooler now, heavy with the scent of freshly watered grass, and for a moment she felt the urge to disappear into the darkness, to let the night swallow her before anyone could demand more. But before she could take a step back, a man detached himself from the crowd and walked toward her with the steady gait of someone accustomed to being observed. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with a lined face and clear, evaluating eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Hannah recognized him from the clubhouse wall, where his photograph hung alongside trophies and framed newspaper clippings. Thomas Harding, former captain of the national golf team, and now one of the most respected coaches in the region. She had never expected to see him outside of those photographs, much less have him standing just a few feet away, looking at her with an expression of measured curiosity. He spoke to the crowd first, his voice carrying easily over the soft rustle of the grass. He said that what they had just seen was not luck, not a fluke or a fortunate bounce, but a shot that required skill and control. If anyone doubted that, he suggested they give the girl another ball and a harder challenge. If she succeeded again, there would be no question left about what she was capable of. The proposal electrified the audience. Several people nodded eagerly, while a few shifted uncomfortably, as though the situation had moved beyond what they had bargained for. Margaret Lawson stood a little apart from the others, her expression unreadable, but after a pause she inclined her head with cool indifference. If this man wanted to see another shot, very well, the girl could have one more chance. The attendants quickly set up a new scenario. A chip shot over a sand trap with the pin cut dangerously close to the edge of the green. Even skilled players misjudged that shot and sent the ball rolling too far or left it short in the bunker. It was a test of precision and nerve. The crowd grew quieter, their anticipation palpable. Hannah felt the tension in her stomach twist tighter. She could feel every pair of eyes fixed on her as she walked toward the next lie. The ground was damp beneath her shoes and the night air pressed close around her. She crouched for a moment, studying the ball's position, the slope of the grass, the distance to the hole. Her palms were damp, but she tightened her grip on the club, letting the weight of it center her. She could hear faint whispers behind her, some skeptical, some excited. It no longer mattered what they said. The only sound she focused on was the faint sigh of the wind moving through the trees and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. She closed her eyes and remembered the evenings with her grandfather when he would stand behind her and adjust her shoulders until they were square. When he would murmur that every good shot began before the club ever moved. She remembered the quiet after each swing, the stillness of the world before the ball landed. When she opened her eyes again, the fear had settled into something calmer, steadier. She took her stance, feet planted firmly, knees slightly bent. Her swing was slow and deliberate, as though time itself had slowed to allow her to prepare. When the club finally connected, there was a sharp, clean sound, the kind of strike that golfers recognized immediately as perfect. The ball rose into the night sky, tracing a gentle arc over the lip of the bunker. For a suspended second, it seemed to hang there, glowing white under the lantern light, before descending softly onto the green. It landed with a muted thud, rolled forward, and stopped a breath away from the flag. A gasp went up from the spectators, followed by applause that grew into genuine cheers. The tension that had gripped the crowd broke like a wave, replaced by excitement and astonishment. Hannah stood frozen for a heartbeat, her breath caught in her throat. Then she exhaled, a slow, trembling release that seemed to drain the last of her fear. Her hands shook slightly as she lowered the club, but it was no longer from nerves. It was the shock of what she had just done, of realizing that she had been capable of this all along. Around her, the applause swelled. Even people who had looked on with skepticism were now clapping, smiling at her as though they had been cheering for her all along. Thomas Harding approached her with a small, approving nod. He spoke to the crowd again, saying that what they had just witnessed was the mark of a natural player, someone with a gift that could not be taught. He said he had spent his life around golfers, watching thousands of swings, and he could count on one hand the number of young players who showed such poise under pressure. He turned back to Hannah and told her, not asked, that she needed to train, that this kind of raw talent could not be left to fade on a driving range. The words settled over her like a promise, and for the first time that evening, Hannah felt the corners of her mouth lift into the faintest smile. Margaret's face had grown tight, her fingers curled against the fabric of her dress. The easy amusement she had worn earlier was gone, replaced by something that looked dangerously close to anger. She said nothing, but the stiffness in her posture spoke volumes. The night that had begun as a display of her authority had shifted into something she could no longer control. The guests were no longer laughing with her. They were focused entirely on the girl with the club, the girl who had turned an impromptu challenge into a triumph. The shift in power was subtle but undeniable. Hannah stood straighter, no longer shrinking under their stares. The humiliation she had feared was gone, replaced by an odd sense of belonging. For the first time since she had started working here, she felt as though she deserved to stand on this perfect green, not as a laborer cleaning up after the members, but as someone who could command their attention on her own terms. The noise of the party had faded into a distant hum. She could hear her own heartbeat, the faint sound of the night insects, the click of someone's phone camera as they captured the moment. The crowd began to break into small groups, talking animatedly, some already looking up Thomas Harding's name on their phones, others glancing at Hannah with open curiosity. It was clear that what had happened tonight would be talked about for a long time. Some of the younger guests even approached Hannah, congratulating her, asking if she had ever competed. She answered quietly, politely, still half in a daze, but she noticed that their tone had changed. They were no longer looking at her as the girl who fetched their practice balls. They were looking at her as a player, a competitor, perhaps even a future champion. As the last of the guests began to drift back toward the clubhouse, Hannah stood for a moment on the edge of the green, letting the quiet settle around her. She could see the stars above, faint against the glow of the club lights, and she felt something shift inside her, a new and unfamiliar certainty. This was not the end of the night. It was the beginning of something she had not even dared to dream of before now. She gripped her grandfather's club more tightly and took a final look at the hole where the ball had stopped so close to perfection. Next time, she thought, it would drop. Next time, she would make sure of it. By the time the last guest disappeared back inside the clubhouse, the night had grown deep and still. The practice green lay quiet again, the lantern light casting long shadows across the short grass, and Hannah stood alone at its edge with her grandfather's club resting lightly in her hand. The noise of applause and the hum of excited voices still echoed in her ears like the aftertaste of thunder. For a moment she wondered if she had imagined it all. The crowd, the cheering, the approving nod from Thomas Harding. But the churned sand in the bunker and the ball still resting near the flag proved that it had all been real. She knelt to pick up the ball, rolling it between her fingers before slipping it into her pocket as if it were a treasure. It wasn't just a ball anymore. It was the moment everything had shifted, the first piece of proof that she could be something more than a worker cleaning up after other people's dreams. She walked slowly back to the shed to put the club away, her mind still spinning. It was past midnight now and the range was empty. The air smelled of cut grass and faint smoke from the clubhouse kitchens, where the last dishes were being scrubbed. Hannah put the club back in its corner carefully, wrapping it in the rag again, as though tucking a child into bed. For years she had touched that club only when no one was watching, as if it were a guilty secret. Tonight, under bright lights, it had given her back something she hadn't realized she'd lost, her sense of direction. The following morning, news of the shots had already spread. A video taken by one of the guests was posted to social media before dawn, and by breakfast it had been shared hundreds of times. The clip showed Hannah in her mud-stained work pants, standing barefoot in the bunker, swinging with effortless grace, and the ball landing neatly on the green. The comments flooded in, people marveling at the poise of a teenage grounds worker, debating whether the shot had been staged, speculating about what the club would do next. By midday, local sports blogs had picked up the story, calling her the girl with the perfect swing. When Hannah arrived for her shift that afternoon, she noticed people watching her differently. Some of the members greeted her with curious smiles. Others stopped to ask whether she had been playing long. A few even asked if she would hit another ball for them to see. She answered politely, but inside she was unsettled. Yesterday she had been invisible. Today she was something like a curiosity, almost a spectacle. She focused on her work, pushing the range cart along the grass, but she could feel their eyes on her back. Late in the day, Thomas Harding returned. He waited for her near the shed, leaning casually against the doorframe. But there was nothing casual in his gaze. He told her he had watched the video again that morning and had come to a decision. He wanted her to start training immediately. He had already spoken to the club board about sponsoring her entry into the state junior championship. Hannah felt her heart leap and then sink almost at once. She wanted to say yes, but her mind filled with practicalities. The cost of transportation, the hours of training, the time away from Caleb and from work. She told him she would think about it, and his expression softened. He said he would be back the next evening to hear her answer. That night, Hannah walked home with the club slung across her shoulder like a soldier returning from battle. Caleb was waiting for her on the porch, his homework spread out on his lap, and when she told him what had happened, his eyes lit up. He had already seen the video on his phone. All the kids at school were talking about it, and he begged her to accept the offer. "You have to do it," he said, his voice full of pride. "You have to show them what you can really do." His belief was simple, unclouded by the worries that pressed on Hannah from every side. The next evening, when Harding returned, Hannah gave him her answer. She would train. Whatever it took, she would find a way. And once she said the words aloud, the fear dissolved, leaving only a steady fire in her chest. Harding smiled, not with surprise but with satisfaction, as though he had expected nothing else. He told her to meet him at dawn the following morning for their first session. The training was relentless. Before the sun came up, Hannah was on the range hitting ball after ball, her arms aching, her palms blistered, while Harding corrected her stance and adjusted her grip. She worked her shift afterward, then returned in the evenings to practice putting and short game until the light faded. Days blurred together, her body constantly tired, but with every week she could feel herself growing stronger, her swing smoother, her confidence deeper. Caleb became her biggest supporter, waking up early to pack her breakfast, waiting for her after practice with a smile and a rundown of how many people had watched her video now. It had reached over 1 million views by the time the first tournament date was announced. Margaret Lawson kept her distance during those weeks. Hannah would catch glimpses of her sometimes, speaking sharply to managers, her face taut with displeasure. There were rumors that the board had overruled her decision to dismiss Hannah after the first night, and that she had been pressured into approving Harding's sponsorship plan. Membership applications were up since the story had gone viral, and the club's publicity team was turning Hannah into the unexpected face of their new youth program. Margaret's expression whenever Hannah's name was mentioned told the story clearly enough. This was not the narrative she had wanted, but it was one she could not escape. The state championship arrived with a clear, bright morning and a crowd larger than anything Hannah had ever imagined. Reporters from the local news stations were there, cameras following her as she walked across the range to warm up. The other players, polished, confident teenagers from wealthy families, eyed her with curiosity, some with thinly veiled disdain. Hannah felt the old fear rise for a moment, but then she remembered the first night, the bunker glowing in the lantern light, and the sound of the crowd gasping when her ball landed on the green. She let the memory settle over her like armor. When it was her turn to tee off, the gallery fell silent. Hannah took her stance, breathing slowly, the weight of the club familiar and comforting in her hands. The first shot soared high and straight, landing in the center of the fairway. A cheer went up from the spectators, and Hannah felt something inside her unlock. Hole after hole, she played with a calm that surprised even herself. Each swing smoother than the last, each putt dropping with a satisfying click. By the final hole, she was near the top of the leaderboard. The last shot of the day was a long putt across a sloping green. The crowd ringed the hole, whispering, holding their breath. Hannah crouched, reading the line, feeling the weight of everything that had brought her here, her grandfather's lessons, the night of humiliation turned triumph, the endless mornings of practice. She drew back the putter and stroked the ball gently. It rolled across the grass, curved perfectly along the break, and fell into the hole with a quiet finality that seemed to echo louder than any cheer. The gallery erupted, and Caleb, standing near the front, jumped up and down, shouting her name. When the scores were tallied, Hannah had taken second place, ahead of players who had been training for years. The reporters crowded around her, asking what it felt like to come so far so fast. Hannah stood in the middle of them, sweaty and tired, but smiling in a way she hadn't smiled in years. She told them that golf wasn't just a sport for those who could afford it, that talent could come from anywhere, that she was proof of that. Over the next months, the club launched a scholarship program for young players from working-class families, and Hannah was named its first ambassador. She spoke at events, encouraging kids like herself to take their first swing, to believe that the green was a place where they belonged too. The girl who had once hidden in the shed with a rag-wrapped club now stood proudly on the first tee of tournaments, cheered by strangers who had come to watch her play. One evening, after another day of practice, Hannah returned to the quiet range and stood alone where it had all begun. The lights glowed softly and the grass smelled sweet. She set a single ball down, swung, and watched it rise into the darkening sky, landing near the pin with a soft thud. She smiled to herself, feeling the weight of all the months behind her and the promise of years ahead. The girl who had once begged for a single chance had found not only her place on the course, but her place in the world. And as she walked off the green, shoulders straight, head high, she knew that whatever came next, bigger tournaments, tougher opponents, louder crowds, she was ready. If this story inspired you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.